Let me tell you the biggest story of the day. It is the biggest story of all mankind as of today. Grok 4 is a powerhouse, can do everything.
For years, historians have argued over why great civilizations fall. Some blame drought, others war, others greed or bad leaders. But when Grok AI lined up centuries of climate records, population drops, lost harvests, and rising pressure across dozens of fallen societies, a strange picture appeared.
What is worst-case scenario? Like, how could AI eventually lead to the destruction of the human race?
They go beyond our existing knowledge base.
Grok 4 is smarter than almost all graduate students in all disciplines.
These places never knew each other, never shared ideas, and never lived in the same world. Yet they all followed the same hidden pattern before they broke. And the scariest part? It's happening again.
Grok shows us 2026 or 2027 is when we're going to hit it. This is the last year that we have.
How Grok cracked 5,000 years of history. It all started when Grok was pointed at thousands of years of human history and told to look for one simple thing: how complex societies come apart.
They showed birth dates, they showed accession dates. We have the history of ancient Maya.
Before Grok ever saw a single timeline, other researchers had already spent years turning the rise and fall of past states into numbers that a machine could read. A team led by the historian Luke Kemp had built what they called a mortality of states record.
Power tends to beget more power. That means that both wealth inequality, and that has a number of corrosive knock-on effects across society.
They tracked the lifespans of more than 400 kingdoms, empires, and republics spread across about 5,000 years.
When water gets behind, it is an exponential process, the systematic collapse of the site.
Each entry marked the moment when a state first appeared as a real, organized government, and the moment when it stopped functioning as one.
The Maya civilization at this time was one of the largest and most awe-inspiring on Earth.
When they studied that record, they found that the risk of collapse rose with age up to around 200 years and then stayed high. Another group had created something even more detailed. This was the Seychat Global History Databank, a huge project that tried to write down in a systematic way what is known about hundreds of past societies. For each one, they recorded basic facts over time: how many people lived there, whether there were large cities, what kind of rulers they had, how taxes were collected, and how wide the gap was between rich and poor. Seychat turned scattered books, field reports, and expert memories into tables that Grok could scan in seconds. Using these foundations, Grok was not just surfing random dates. It was reading an organized story of human complexity. To make sense of that story, the team first agreed on what counted as a civilization and what counted as collapse. In this work, a civilization was a large-scale, settled society with towns and cities, a central government, and clear layers of power. People shared big projects such as canals, roads, temples, and palaces, backed by written rules, taxes, and full-time officials. A collapse meant that this web of organization broke down quickly. The central government failed or split. Long-distance trade shrank. Large building projects stopped. Cities emptied or lost basic services. The population either dropped or spread into smaller communities. It was a quick fall from a strong, complex system to a much simpler and weaker one, even though the people and their culture were still there. Once those definitions were in place, Grok was given a very wide sample of past civilizations. Some were hard crashes, where a central system failed and never really came back in that region in the same form. Others were softer landings, where the state changed shape or moved, but people and culture carried on. The list stretched across most of the settled world. It included the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia, the classic Maya city-states of the Yucatan, the Khmer capital at Angkor in what is now Cambodia, the Indus Valley Civilization with its planned brick cities, the western half of the Roman world, Norse Greenland at the edge of the Arctic, and islands like Rapa Nui, also known as Easter Island. They all covered a wide range of climates, cultures, and time periods, so that any shared pattern would have to be something deep, not a local accident. To look for that kind of pattern, the team turned many kinds of evidence into a few shared streams of data. One stream was climate and environment. For Angkor and nearby parts of Southeast Asia, tree ring experts rebuilt about 7.5 centuries of wet and dry years from long-lived trees, with thin rings marking drought and wide rings marking strong monsoon seasons. In other regions, deposits in caves and cores from the seabed showed long dry spells, extra dust, and weaker river flow, including the sharp drying about 4,200 years ago that struck places like Mesopotamia. In South Asia, records from ancient lakes and caves showed monsoon rains fading over many centuries as Indus cities lost their dense urban form. Another stream captured how people used land and natural resources. Pollen grains trapped in mud layers revealed when forests shrank and were replaced by grass or crops. Tiny fragments of charcoal showed how often people burned fields or woodland. Erosion in valleys and on slopes showed soil under stress and hillsides stripped of cover. In Mesopotamia and the Angkor heartland, the remains of canals, dikes, and reservoirs, together with salty old soils, showed how hard farmers pushed their water systems and how close they came to the edge of what the land could take. Together, these clues became a land use stream for Grok. How quickly forests disappeared, how intense farming became, and how much the ground was being worn down. A third stream followed population, wealth, and the gap between ordinary people and elites. Archaeologists used counts of house foundations, settlement sizes, and layers of trash to estimate how many people lived in a city or region at different times. Where written records survived, like in parts of the Roman world and some Asian states, historians could look at wages, tax lists, and legal complaints to see whether everyday workers could keep up with rising prices and tax demands. The size of graves, the presence of rich goods in a few burials, and clusters of luxury imports all pointed to widening inequality. From this, Grok could track how inequality and social pressure rose or fell over time. A fourth stream tracked power and violence. Scribes and chroniclers wrote about rebellions, civil wars, and foreign invasions. City walls were strengthened or abandoned. Forts on frontiers went from busy to empty. Tax systems were revised again and again as rulers tried to squeeze more from a tired base. All of this could be coded in simple ways. How many internal conflicts were reported in a given stretch of years, and how often the ruling family changed. Together, these measures gave Grok a sense of how strong or fragile a state's core institutions were at each point in time. None of these streams was perfect on its own. A tree ring does not record a tax revolt. A broken canal does not record the anger of farmers. A list of kings does not record the health of a forest. But once the data had been cleaned and put on the same scale, Grok could read them together as different sensors on the same giant system. The key move was how time was lined up. For each civilization in the sample, the team chose a final moment when the old central system was still clearly in place. That point became year zero in the model. Then Grok looked backward from there, step by step, often 2 or 3 centuries into the past, tracing how climate, land use, inequality, and state strength rose or fell. After doing this for many cases, those aligned histories could be stacked. The machine no longer saw separate stories. It saw a cloud of overlapping paths leading to the same kind of endpoint, each path shaped by the same small set of changing numbers. The team also gave Grok examples of societies that faced severe stress, but did not collapse in the same way. One key example came from the oldest known civilization in the Americas, centered on places like Corral on the central coast of what is now Peru. Around 4,200 years ago, that region went through a long drought tied to a wider climate shift that harmed other early states. Archaeologists at Corral and nearby sites have found little evidence of long civil wars. Instead, communities moved from the main inland centers toward coastal and river areas that still had more stable water and food. Trade routes linking fishing villages and farming regions stayed active. Murals and other art from the time warned about climate and the careful use of resources. When those details were converted into data, Corral looked very different from a classic collapse. Climate lines still showed a sharp and painful drying. Some settlements were abandoned. Yet the signs of internal violence stayed low, and evidence for long-distance exchange carried on. The pattern of life changed, but the basic social fabric did not tear in the same way as in hard crash cases. For Grok, that made Corral a crucial contrast case, a kind of near miss that marked the boundary between breakdown and adaptation. By the time all these pieces were in place, researchers were no longer looking at scattered legends or isolated disasters. It was looking at a cleaned-up, coded record of how many civilizations grew complex, faced stress, and either snapped or bent. When it sifted through those aligned histories, the same rough curve kept flashing in the background. Certain lines rose together, others flattened or stalled, and then harsh shocks hit systems that were already under strain. The exact shape of that curve, and how it played out in specific collapses, came into focus only when the lives of those past civilizations were followed one by one. The one pattern behind every civilization's collapse. When you set the big collapses of history side by side, they stop looking like random bad luck. The names, gods, and weapons all change, but the basic curve of the story stays the same. That chain has 5 moves. First, there is a boom, when a state pulls in more land and food, builds up its cities, and grows in complexity. Then comes a squeeze, when wealth and power drift upward and ordinary people are pushed harder with taxes, debts, and work. Third is strain, when land, forests, water systems, and trade routes are used so heavily that even small problems start to bite. Fourth comes a shock, such as a long drought, a string of crop failures, a big war, or a crash in trade. Last is the snap, when the old institutions fail to adjust, and the system breaks apart or drains away instead of bending. Every collapse in this analysis followed this exact sequence. The Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia is one of the earliest clear runs of this script. In the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, Sargon of Akkad and his successors pulled together a wide belt of cities and farms across the lands that are now Iraq and nearby regions. They leaned hard on irrigated grain fields fed by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and pushed farming into drier fringe lands. For a time, the boom looked unstoppable. Clay tablets describe large grain deliveries and rations, and the royal court poured wealth into temples and palaces in big urban centers like Akkad and Ur. The squeeze showed up in how tightly the empire tied its survival to those irrigation works. Canals had to be dug longer and kept clear across many miles of countryside. Fields in risky dry zones were no longer backup land. They became part of the normal food supply. When water was short, or a canal silted up, the first people to suffer were small farmers and laborers, not the palace. Salt slowly built up in some soils where water was spread and evaporated again and again. The richest households and temple estates could still grab the best plots, while everyone else carried more and more risk. Then came the wider climate strain. Deep-sea cores and land records from across Southwest Asia show that around 4,200 years ago, the region slid into a long, harsh, dry spell now known as the 4.2 kilo-year event. Dust layers and other markers point to stronger winter dust storms and sharp drops in rainfall and river flow. Harvests would have failed not just in one valley but across the wider agricultural zone that fed the empire. With soils already tired and irrigation stretched, there was not much slack left. That was the shock that pushed the system into the snap phase. Archaeological surveys in northern Mesopotamia show that many towns and villages were abandoned around this time, and settlement maps thin out in areas that had once been thick with farms. Written later, memory texts talk about famine, unrest, and people moving in search of food. The empire did not vanish in a single year, and wars and local rebellions clearly played a part, but the old central state never recovered its reach. The classic Maya lowlands on the Yucatan Peninsula show the same chain in a different setting. Between about the 3rd and 9th centuries of the Common Era, Maya city-states built stepped pyramids, carved stone monuments, and dense urban centers in what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. Kings and noble houses competed through warfare, ritual displays, and alliance building. The boom phase showed up in the rapid spread of cities and the surge of monument building that marked royal lines and victories. Farmers around these cities cleared forests, built terraces and raised fields, and turned seasonal wetlands into food machines to keep up with the demand. The squeeze fell on ordinary people and on the landscape. Forest cover shrank as more trees were cut for fuel and building and to open new plots. Thin soils on hillsides and fragile karst ground were brought under the plow. Noble families poured labor and resources into prestige projects, temples, and court life, even as they fought each other for status. Common farmers had to keep food flowing into the cities, pay tribute, and sometimes serve in war. When harvests dipped, elite households had stores and connections to fall back on. Those at the bottom had less and less margin for bad years. New cave science has made the strain and shock phases much clearer. A stalagmite from a cave near the modern town of Tico in northwest Yucatan recorded wet season rainfall year by year between the late 9th and early 11th centuries of the Common Era. In a study published in 2025, researchers showed that this record captured 8 severe wet season droughts during the terminal Classic period. Every one of those droughts lasted at least 3 years, and one of them stretched for about 13 years, with only very short breaks between dry spells. For farmers already operating at maximum capacity, this meant repeated total crop failure. The snap is written into the stones of the cities. In many lowland centers, the carving of dated stone monuments stops during and after these droughts. Archaeologists find hastily built defenses, traces of burning, and then layers of abandonment. Some places, like Uxmal, seem to fall quickly after extreme droughts, while other centers, such as Chichen Itza, stayed active longer, likely because they were better tied into trade routes that could bring in food and prestige goods. Again, climate stress did not act alone. It landed on top of intense elite competition and a strained farming base. The boom and squeeze had already prepared the ground. The droughts provided the shocks that finished the job in many cities. Angkor, in what is now Cambodia, shows how even brilliant engineering can end up trapped in the same pattern. For centuries, the Khmer Empire built one of the largest pre-industrial urban complexes on Earth, centered on a hydraulic city that turned monsoon rains into stable rice harvests. A dense grid of canals, embankments, and giant reservoirs called barrays stored wet season water and fed it out to fields in the dry months. The boom phase here was the build-out of that water machine and the temple city around it. Rice surpluses supported a large population, a big court, and a series of huge stone temples like Angkor Wat. Over time, that success created its own squeeze and strain. More canals and control structures meant more points that had to be maintained. Forests around Angkor were cleared for fields and for timber, which increased erosion and sent more sediment into the waterway. As the system became more complex, it also became harder to repair or redesign quickly. Rulers and elites gained status from running this huge water network, so they kept pushing to expand it instead of simplifying it. The city's wealth and power depended on a water system that was impressive, but also increasingly fragile. Climate records from tree rings in nearby highlands show that, starting in the 14th century, the region moved into a period of extreme ups and downs, with decades-long droughts broken by bursts of very heavy monsoon rain. A 7.5-century ring record highlights 2 especially fierce droughts in the mid-14th and early 15th centuries. At the same time, models of Angkor's canal system show that once flood levels rose past a certain point, the network could fail in a chain reaction, with embankments overflowing and channels being torn out in ways that were hard to control. The system had been engineered for predictable patterns, not violent extremes. Those swings formed the shock phase. A network tuned for a more stable monsoon suddenly had to cope with stretches of deep drought and then years of destructive flooding. Repairs became harder as damage piled up. Geoarchaeological work inside the city shows channels choked with sediment and signs of repeated recutting and abandonment rather than smooth upkeep. Over the 15th century, political power moved away from Angkor toward river ports closer to the sea, such as the area around today's Phnom Penh. The old capital did not fall in one attack. It was left behind because its water system, and the political order built on it, was too rigid to handle the wild climate swings and the shift in trade. The Western Roman Empire shows the same chain spread across a continent. For many centuries, Rome grew from a small city-state into an empire that reached from Britain to North Africa. Conquest and taxes supported a large professional army and a tight network of cities linked by roads and sea routes. The boom years built stone towns with baths, arenas, and forums, and paid for grain shipments to feed city populations that no longer grew their own food. Underneath, the squeeze built up over generations. Land ownership was concentrated into large estates run by powerful families, while smallholders were squeezed by debts, rents, and taxes. Many ended up as tenant farmers on big estates, or as poor city dwellers. Work inspired by structural demographic theory argues that the number of people trying to live as elites or near elites rose faster than the number of real positions in the imperial system, a process known as elite overproduction. Real wages for common workers tended to fall over the long run, and the tax system had to pull hard on the countryside to keep armies and court life going. The state still functioned, but the margin for error shrank. Strain came from both nature and politics. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, large disease outbreaks such as the Antonine and Cyprian plagues cut population and tax income and weakened the army. At the same time, civil wars between rivals for the throne became more common. To keep troops loyal, emperors often paid higher wages or allowed soldiers and local elites to take more from provincial populations, deepening the squeeze on the base. Frontier defenses cost more and more, especially along the Rhine and Danube, just as internal stability was weakening. The shock phase was the cluster of crises in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Emperors rose and fell in quick succession. Armies that were supposed to guard the borders fought each other instead. Groups like the Goths and Vandals, pushed partly by pressures and migrations beyond the frontier, entered the empire as both refugees and fighting forces. Key defeats like the Battle of Adrianople showed that the old balance of power had shifted. Cities were sacked, and whole regions were devastated or lost to imperial control. The snap was not a single fall, but a drawn-out loss of central control in the West. Tax systems broke down in some provinces. The coins lost value. Big landowners often acted as local power centers with their own private armed followings. By the time the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in the late 5th century, the imperial state in the West had already fractured into a patchwork of successor kingdoms. Roman law, language, and religion lived on, but the old imperial system that had tied 3 continents together could no longer hold its own weight. The Norse settlements in Greenland show the same basic pattern at a much smaller scale and on a much harsher edge of the world. In the late 10th century, settlers from Iceland and Norway established 2 main clusters of farms on the southwest coast of Greenland, usually called the Eastern and Western settlements. They brought cattle, sheep, and goats, built stone churches and farmhouses, and tied themselves into trade routes that sent walrus ivory and other goods to Europe in exchange for iron, timber, and luxury items. Their boom was modest compared to Rome, but for a few centuries they maintained a thin Christian farming society in a very cold place. From the beginning, though, the squeeze and strain were built into their way of life. The farms sat near the limit of what the local climate would allow for grass growth. To feed their animals, the Norse cleared scrub and dwarf trees and grazed fragile soils. Lake sediment records from places such as Lake Igaliku show that soil erosion sped up after Norse settlement, with erosion rates roughly doubling compared with the natural background once farming took hold. The settlers also depended on long sea routes for iron and other vital supplies, and on walrus ivory for much of their cash income. That left them exposed both to local climate change and to shifts in far-off markets. Climate strain gathered over the later centuries of the colony. Studies of North Atlantic temperatures and ice show that from the 14th century onward, parts of Greenland became colder and stormier, with more sea ice and shorter growing seasons as part of the wider Little Ice Age. At the same time, European demand for walrus ivory fell as other sources became available. Isotope studies of Norse skeletons from Greenland show that over time their diet shifted toward more marine foods like seals, a sign that farming was yielding less and they were leaning more on hunting. The safety margin narrowed. The shock phase was really a pile of hits rather than one single blow. The regular cargo ship that had linked Greenland to Norway seems to have stopped coming by the late 14th century, and one known vessel on that route sank and was not replaced. The Black Death and later crises weakened the Norwegian kingdom that oversaw Greenland, making it harder to send help or enforce obligations. A Norwegian priest, Ivar Bardarson, wrote in the mid-14th century that when he sailed to the western settlement, he found it empty, with only stray livestock left behind. By the 15th century, burials at Herjolfsnes show smaller bodies and more signs of stress, pointing to years of hardship. The Norse presence in Greenland faded out over the 15th century. There was no final recorded last stand, just a slow snap as farms were abandoned, churches fell silent, and the remaining population either died out or left. The signs our world is sliding into the pattern. Today's world already sits somewhere on the same curve that brought older civilizations down. The long boom has happened. Huge growth, huge cities, and a level of connection that no empire in the past ever came close to. The question now is where we are on the rest of that curve, and whether we keep sliding toward the same kind of break that showed up again and again when Grok read the old history. In March 2021, a single container ship blocking the Suez Canal for 6 days disrupted global supply chains worth billions of dollars daily. One ship, one canal, 6 days of blockage. Right now, one giant interconnected system spans Earth. Almost 8 billion people live inside it, tied together by trade, fuel, food, money, and data moving around the planet every hour. A factory shutting down in one country can raise food prices in another. That level of tight connection is the modern version of the boom phase. Very high complexity, very high output, and a huge amount of dependence on long chains that nobody fully controls. The squeeze part of the old pattern shows up today in how wealth and power are stacked. The richest 1% now hold close to half of all global wealth and have captured most of the new wealth created in recent years. At the same time, many millions of young, educated people in many countries are chasing a small number of high-status jobs. Luke Kemp and others point out that big, unequal systems like this are historically fragile because they rely on tight control over food, force, and people's movement, and they can come apart fast when pressure builds. That is the squeeze side of the curve playing out on a global scale. The strain part of the curve is written into the land, water, and air. 6 of 9 key Earth systems that kept the planet stable in the past have already been pushed beyond their safe zone. These include climate, the health of living things, land use, fresh water, chemical pollution, and the nitrogen and phosphorus that run through farms and rivers. Later checks suggest that even a 7th boundary, tied to ocean chemistry, may now be crossed or very close. In plain terms, the base that supports food, water, and stable weather is under stress at the same time as our system is more complex and more tightly linked than ever. Water tells the same story. NASA work and follow-up studies show that many of the world's big underground water stores are being drained far faster than they refill, especially in dry farming regions that export crops to the rest of the world. In some places, farmers are using water that will not come back in this century, or at all. One Columbia University analysis warned that this kind of groundwater overuse is a hidden risk for the global food system, because when those aquifers finally run dry, food shocks in one region can spread quickly through trade. The shock clusters have already started to show what happens when that strain meets weak or rigid institutions. In Syria, a stretch of severe drought from the mid-2000s into around 2010 hit farm regions that were already stressed by bad water policy and loss of support. Studies link the drought to climate change and show how failing crops pushed rural families toward cities just before the wider conflict exploded, turning environmental stress into part of a much more violent crisis. In Darfur, United Nations reports have long noted how land damage, spreading desert, and fights over shrinking grazing and water spots added fuel to ethnic and political tensions. These are not full global collapses, but they look a lot like local runs of the same curve, long strain, followed by shocks, followed by breakage in places that could not bend. Hunger and conflict in wider regions show the same mix. The World Food Programme warns that tens of millions of people in West and Central Africa now face serious food shortages, driven by conflict, high prices, and extreme weather hitting the same places at once. Joint early warning reports from the Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Food Programme list places like Sudan, South Sudan, Mali, and Haiti as hotspots at immediate risk of starvation because war, economic crashes, and climate shocks stack on top of one another. This is what a stressed global system looks like before a full break. Not one big fall, but many regional crises that test how much support and flexibility the wider system still has. On top of that, there are risk layers no ancient empire ever had to face. Organizations that track nuclear weapons estimate there are now approximately 12,000 nuclear warheads in the world, with around 9,000 of them in military stockpiles and about 2,000 kept on high alert by the United States and Russia. Several nuclear-armed states are modernizing or expanding their arsenals, which raises the stakes of any large conflict far beyond anything Rome or Angkor ever had to worry about. At the same time, powerful tools in biology and genetics can now be used to alter viruses and bacteria. Those fields mostly aim to cure disease, but they also create new paths for accidents or misuse that could spread across borders much faster than any ancient plague. The digital layer that holds the modern boom together can also carry sudden shocks. In 2021, a single ransomware attack forced the Colonial Pipeline Company in the United States to shut down about 5,500 miles of fuel pipeline for several days, cutting gas supplies across large parts of the East Coast. One company, in one country, for less than 1 week. It still caused fuel shortages, panic buying, and wide economic concern. Energy experts point out that more such attacks on grids, pipelines, or ports would spread through supply chains just as fast. This is the new version of shock. Not only droughts and wars, but also digital hits that shut down the very systems we built to make life smoother. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.